So thanks everyone for attending today and attending our very quick special general meeting. Please don't ever hesitate if you have any questions about anything, whether it's during a meeting or you reach out to us by email or messenger or phone, whatever suits you best. But we're always here to answer your questions or queries. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. My name is Nell Thompson. I'm the Secretary of the Australian Institute of Animal Management, and I'll be hosting the webinar for you today. I've been on the AIM committee since 2013, and I'm also the coordinator of the National Getting to Zero program. The Australian Institute of Animal Management, or as we call it AIM, is the national peak body representing local government animal management officers. The AIM committee consists of a wide range of professionals engaged in the various aspects of animal management. AIM seeks to support those engaged in the business of animal management and the function itself by providing training and information, opportunities for networking and collaboration, and by encouraging the use of best practice policies and practices. AIM understands the significant pressures placed on local government and the not-for-profit spaces and service providers when working in the companion animal management space. We welcome new members, and people can join via our website at www.aim.org.au. So to the second half of our agenda today. Once I hand over to our presenter, there'll be around 50 minutes of presentation and around 10 minutes of question time once the presentation is concluded. The recording of this webinar will be accessible via our website to all members to watch at any time. We're going to ask that everyone mutes themselves during the presentation unless our presenter indicates otherwise. And if you have any questions, you can start putting them in the Q&A section, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end of the session. If you have very quick questions that relate to your understanding of the content, put your hand up and we'll try to get to those during the presentation. And if you have more questions or we don't get to yours during the question time, you can always send a message to our Facebook page and we will get to you that way. So as always, please excuse any working from home background noises that may filter through, i.e. barking dogs. I'm happy to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Jessica Hoops. Jessica and I are at pretty much opposite ends of the country. She's located in Cairns, I'm down here in Southern Victoria. And Jessica is a Canadian veterinarian and member of the Veterinarians Abroad Supporting and Teaching Team, or VAST. In the past 6 years, she's been involved in veterinary medicine, animal welfare and animal management fields in Fiji and Papua New Guinea, with the majority of her work focusing on the development of community-focused humane dog population management programs. Jessica is also an AIM member, which we love, so thank you, Jess. So over to you, Jessica. We will leave questions to the end and enjoy the webinar, everybody.
Thanks, Nell. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And I'll apologize in advance for the accent and fast talking. It's something I'm working on. So thank you for having me here today for our webinar entitled Lesson from the Trenches, Pearls of Wisdom in Companion Animal Management from the Pacific Islands. As Nell said, I've spent the majority of my time over the last 6 years working in veterinary clinic, shelter and animal management programs in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. Since I've moved to Australia, I've kind of maintained my associations in Fiji in a remote capacity, working towards a sustainable dog population management program, which is currently in the early stages of baseline data collection. My career so far has provided me with a unique opportunity to gain exposure to many different aspects of the animal management field, from running a shelter to doing outreach clinics for desexing, to community engagement, to running dog collections for the local city council. And it's also given me a chance to work with initiatives at the national, state, municipal, and community levels in a number of different cultural and socioeconomic environments. These experiences have provided me with a really unique perspective on approaching companion animal management issues, particularly in the context of resource-limited environments, where you're required to do careful consideration of your resource allocation, and you must ensure that those resources are appropriately positioned to ensure your programs are effective. From this, I've put together what I feel to be pertinent insights into overcoming some of the challenges we encounter in the companion animal management field. And I truly hope that these insights can help support others in developing effective, sustainable companion animal management programs. So first, I'll be honest, most of my personal and professional experience in this industry has been acquired in a trial by fire type environment. And at least initially, as I kind of first delved into it, by doing things the hard way. So a lot of these pearls of wisdom I'll be discussing today reflect issues that I've personally faced during my time working overseas. And in more ways than one, either myself or one of my colleagues has struggled and ultimately failed. The contents of this presentation are pulled together on the basis of those failures, hoping that others won't make the same mistakes. I really hope that these insights will help you to reconceptualize your animal management programs and help you to maximize your impacts through strategic and effective use of available resources. So by and large, in all of my time working in this field, the most important lesson I've learned is that you need to approach companion animal management issues holistically, moving away from our narrow focus or what we're doing today or what our programs are doing now, and taking everything you can into consideration by looking at the big picture. Stemming from this understanding, I've put together 6 fundamental components of a companion animal management program that are essential to provide you and your community the companion animal management program of your dreams, which we'll go through one by one. The first lesson is data, the importance of data collection. Today, I'll be talking a lot about data collection because I truly believe it has a fundamental importance to our ability to effectively address companion animal management issues. Data is crucial in almost every industry for sound decision-making, and our sector is really no exception. But I guess you're asking me, why is data collection so important for the amount of time and energy it takes? Well, we work in a field that necessitates resource-heavy programs to affect sustainable changes. And in many cases, no matter where you are in the world, these programs need to occur in the context of a resource-limited environment. We never have all the resources we want to do the things that we want to do. In this setting, using impact-based research-focused practices is absolutely essential in order to inform and prioritize resource allocation on programs and initiatives that have the greatest potential to achieve effective, sustainable outcomes. And in order to do this, we need data. We need to know what we're doing. Research-informed practice requires accurate, timely, and transparent data collection so that we can effectively identify and target high-risk animal populations and communities and ensure the development of sustainable programs. But more importantly, if you think about it, if you don't have data, how do you know if what you're doing is working? Despite the importance of data as an industry, routine data collection, and more importantly, published data linking our activities to sustainable impacts is actually quite lacking. And it is often this inability to provide relevant and accurate statistics that undermines our ability to present credible arguments, substantiating the need for concerted efforts to address the most pressing companion animal management issues. This is an area that we as an industry can improve upon by incorporating timely, accurate, and routine data collection, as well as transparent knowledge sharing into our daily practices. If you think about it, the programs we run are very much like answering a research question. For example, why do animal control officers collect dogs? Our programs are essentially conducting a research experiment. We've identified a problem, for example, dog overpopulation. We also identify a solution that we feel is going to work. For example, collecting dogs off the street. And the program itself is essentially a means for testing our hypothesis that the activities we are currently engaged in have the potential to bring about the desired impact that we want. Aside from these basic arguments on why data collection is essential, some other big reasons for supporting the use of data collection and disclosure include our ability to maximize resources, which I've already explained, making sound programs decisions by identifying programs that have a direct impact on the populations we're trying to target, accountability and upholding public trust, securing our community support, securing funding resources, monitoring and evaluation, and identifying areas for performance improvement. So I'm going to give you an example. This is a fairly typical scenario I encounter when I'm coordinating with stakeholders to evaluate current interventions to look forward when developing dog population management programs. For this example, which is a fictional example, but similar to things that I've seen, let's say this information was provided by a national organization to try to provide me with the scope of what they're doing to manage the dog population. So usually I'll wait a couple months and I'll get a table that looks like this: the year and the number of animals collected. While this is really, really great data, and obviously goes back a long time, I really want you to think about this. What does this data tell me about the dog problem on a national level? Does it tell me anything about the impact of the current programs on the roaming dog population? Is this really the data that we need to answer the question on what's happening and what's it doing? While all data can be useful in a resource-limited environment, maximizing your resources means ensuring that the data you collect is relevant to your community, clearly frames the issues you are hoping to address, and evaluates the impacts you are hoping to achieve. This brings me to my next lesson, the importance of relevant data collection. Okay, so which data is relevant? I'm going to walk you through a lot of slides that kind of help you conceptualize your data collection and conceptualize the problem you're trying to solve. When working to ensure that you're collecting relevant data, the first thing you want to do is think of a simplified intervention cycle or a simplified program cycle, and consider what variables you need to identify and monitor in order to answer and track each of these questions. What's the issue you're trying to address? What are we doing to address this issue, either past or present? Is it working? And what can we do differently? In my experience, most of the organizations I've worked with tend to focus their data internally on what is currently being done. For the most part, this means the resources, the activities, and the outputs that are currently in place. In many cases, these existing activities have been heavily reliant on established outputs from the industry and are based on historical precedents for programs that have already been in place and have often been in place for years. They go through the what are we doing? But meanwhile, defining and evaluating the root causes of the problem and the dynamic processes contributing to the issue, as well as the impact of the interventions and programs on humans and animals in the broader community context, is often limited. In my experience, this approach is pretty disadvantageous from the perspective of maximizing your resources to get the most bang for your buck, because it prevents true understanding of the issue at hand and also fails to address the impact of the interventions and programs on the community that you're serving. While there's no doubt that evaluating internal statistics is an important piece of the puzzle and provides metrics for evaluating your internal processes, in isolation, it provides limited information of the overall impact of your efforts on the bigger picture. Think about it. What does knowing the number of dogs collected by animal control or the number of animals adopted through a shelter tell you about the outcomes and impacts you're hoping to achieve? So I've talked about kind of what not to do. Now we'll start to go through what to do. So the best way to holistically conceptualize data collection is to use the same logical framework or theory of change that we would use to identify, plan, and develop our programs. The beginning part of this kind of starts where any story would. We start by defining and understanding the issue we're trying to address. By answering the questions, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So what are the needs, programs, or issues that need to be addressed by our program or intervention? And two, what are the factors contributing to this issue? What are the underlying drivers and factors sustaining this issue in our community? Why is it happening? So the logical approach to understanding your problem, looking at your basics, the key questions you need to consider when determining data that is relevant to your organization is to consider these questions. Again, what is the issue we're trying to solve? You've heard me say that quite a few times. Why does the issue exist? Where does it come from? For example, stray dogs, where are they coming from? Are they stray? Are they owned? Where are the puppies coming from that produce that population? What are the factors motivating and sustaining this issue in your community? What is currently and has historically been done to address this issue? And what is the impact of current programs or interventions? So pulling out that kind of intervention cycle into kind of a longer question thing. In order to be effective in anything, a proper understanding of the issue at hand requires us to shift our focus from managing a symptom to managing the animal population in our community context. Why is this so important? Because to be successful, management strategies must be designed or adapted to suit the dynamics of both human and animal populations in our specific locale. This is essential for determining the goals for our program and clearly identifying the issues to be targeted, and in having us understand there's really no one-size-fits-all approach. For example, in the South Pacific, dog bite injuries towards humans is a common motivator for dog population management programs. And many of the programs involve trapping and culling stray dogs on the street. But if you look at the problem, and you look especially at published impacts of dog bites, the vast majority of them were caused by owned dogs allowed to roam. So by removing stray dogs off the street, are you really, really looking at your issue, or do you need to replan? So we've got our baseline under control. We know what our problem is. The next step in our theory of change is determining our long-term goals of our program. What's the impact you're hoping to achieve? For example, reducing the number of dog bite injuries in a community. Your desired impacts are your big goals, your long-term goals, and they should be in line with your organization's vision, mission, or objectives. And all of these should be taken into consideration when you're planning a program and developing a plan for data collection that will be used to analyze and evaluate your activities. This is more challenging because our goals cannot be definitively measured. Our accomplishments can't be definitively measured. This makes it important from the perspective of data collection to identify indicators or things that we can measure that help to tell us these impacts have occurred and to help us integrate these into our data collection framework. Although your impacts should be tailored to your specific programs and your community, some of the key impacts across all facets of animal management are outlined by the International Coalition of Animal Management's key objectives for population management programs. These include promotion of responsible pet ownership, decreasing pet abandonment, improvement of companion animal health and welfare, reduced risks to public health and safety, and this would include your zoonotic disease transmission, or those diseases that go human to animal and vice versa, as well as dog bite injuries and other risks to public health and safety caused by animals, whether stray and on the street or owned. Preventing harm to animals and the environment. This is another big one, especially with cat population management and the effect on wildlife. Reducing the numbers of free roaming animals and achieving the sustainable companion animal population. If you think about it, basically at least one of these will be useful for your long-term goals for your programs, depending on what you do, one or more. All right, so we know our beginning and we've thought about our end. Once we've done these things, we need to conceptualize logical key steps to achieve our program goals. That is, we need to fill in the gaps, working backwards from our impacts and our desired goals to the roots of the problem we are trying to address. This theory of change is in essence our conceptual roadmap, our pathway of change that establishes the logical steps in describing how a program or intervention will achieve the desired impacts, revealing the pertinent data required at each step in the process. So filling in the gaps, I'm going to work forwards instead of backwards and contradict what I just said, but we think about the inputs. So what are the financial, human, and material resources required to do the programs we want to do? What are the activities, the program, services, deliverables, or other actions that we're going to take to address the problem and bring about change? What are our outputs? So these are the deliverables that result from our activities. In many cases, this is simply a means of quantifying our activities. Our outcomes. These are the intermediate or stepwise goals, the changes we need to see in order to achieve our long-term goal. And our impacts. These are ultimately our long-term goals or objectives for a program or intervention. For each of these things, you need to be conceptualizing the data that you need in order to be able to monitor and evaluate your programs. So thinking about it, how does adoptions and rehoming lead to a reduction in abandoned or unwanted animals? And you need to do the follow through from your activities all the way through to the end in your impact and see whether your process makes sense and what data you need to collect to get there. From a program development perspective, it's best to work through your conceptual roadmap prior to starting a program. However, for many of us, this may not be practical as we're dealing with established programs and key performance outputs that are already in place. Regardless, the thought process is incredibly useful when integrating more comprehensive data collection into our existing programs, as it can help to establish a data collection process and track our changes moving forward. It can also be used to provide an understanding of what has already happened and the data that has already been collected. In order to find your data gaps, existing data can be mapped onto this theory of change and can be used to identify your priority areas for additional data collection. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of work, but trust me, as we go through the rest of the presentation, you'll start to see that it really is essential in having successful programs. So the next step that we need to do is to create our database. The first thing I can recommend is to consult an epidemiologist or statistician who has a background in companion animal management to help develop a data collection management framework that is tailored to the needs of your organization. The next thing you want to do is utilize that logical framework to identify pertinent data and statistics that you need to collect that are relevant to your situation and help you understand the issues in your community, and to analyze the impact of your programs to facilitate monitoring, evaluation, and program management. For this, if it's possible, don't reinvent the wheel. You can utilize established guidelines and benchmark statistics. For example, the shelter and rehoming industry has fairly well-established guidelines, and integrate those into your logical framework, and then identify gaps for your personal programs. The next step is to identify pertinent indicators. These are the measurable signs of the impact you're hoping to achieve that are relevant to your situation. Be sure to consider methods of measurement that you can practically perform with the resources you have available. Next, you want to select a data management system that suits the needs of your organization, the resources you have available, and can be easily maintained by personnel in your organization. For me, this has traditionally been Excel spreadsheets, but I know, again, the shelter era has lots of good management software that can be used for this purpose. As with most things, you're going to want to develop policies and procedures that outline data collection management and analysis so that it can become routine in your organization. And you're going to want to provide training and guidance for personnel that will be responsible for this data collection and maintaining the database. This should be based on their individual capabilities and interests. All right, I think you've heard me talk enough about data probably by now. The third lesson that I learned is the value of community engagement and participatory efforts. Now, community engagement and the importance thereof is widely acknowledged in the context of having good ethical practice in circumstances where external research or interventions are being conducted on a community. So stuff coming from outside in. But in companion animal management situations where our programs and interventions are being conducted in our backyard, it tends to be overlooked. While the ethical importance of community participation cannot be understated, in our industry and for our purposes, community engagement is also essential for understanding and addressing the root causes of our management issues and encouraging community support and uptake of our programs. Another way to think about it is think of the community we work in as our client. While we endeavor to make positive changes for the humans and animals in our community, we must also consider that the activities that we do have a bit of a business context, and we're providing services and programs to our clients within the community. But by and large, most importantly, one of the biggest reasons for involving your community is that companion animal population dynamics are closely linked with human activities. At the most basic level, companion animal overpopulation and issues associated with it, such as dog bites, nuisance behavior, and things like that, it's a socio-cultural problem stemming directly from human behavior. This is particularly true for domestic dogs, that have a link to humans a little bit different than cats, because there's considerable evidence that domestic dog populations are not reproductively capable of sustaining their population size without direct or indirect human support, meaning that their dogs being there is highly reliant on humans. Why do we care? Interventions addressing the symptoms of these companion animal management issues. For example, focusing on the animals themselves or the problems they cause, which is something that we do commonly in our industry, often leads to a band-aid fix that fails to address the root causes and problems. So we get into a cycle of doing the same thing over and over again. Improving companion animal welfare and mitigating any negative impacts on public health or other animals or the environment really does necessitate both an understanding of our community as well as participation from the community. The other thing to think about is that issues pertaining to animal management are multifactorial, and risk factors and attitudes vary not only between communities, but also within the community. Therefore, having a timely understanding of these dynamic processes within your community is essential. For one example, does your community see the issues you are targeting as a problem? Or are we simply assuming that we have shared values? How will this impact our programs? The other thing we need to consider is that our community has to have the capacity for the intended changes to take place. Our programs must occur within the limits of what our community is capable of. Stemming from all of this, you need to be wary of the one-size-fits-all approach. One strategy may not be successful in every situation, and the same method may not always be consistently successful within the same community. The other important thing to remember is that engaging your community is not a one-time event. This is an ongoing process that evolves as human behaviors towards animals and the issues therein change over time. So I've talked a lot about the importance of community engagement, but I guess I should talk about what it is. So basically, community engagement is a process of enabling conversations and dialogue and building relationships between people in a community. And when we're working in our own community, this also includes us. Community engagement reflects equitable involvement between an organization looking to make changes and those affected by the issue under intervention in all aspects of the program, if possible. This means the essential involvement of communities in defining and prioritizing animal management issues and in the development of programs and interventions to target these issues. While local government may be ultimately responsible for companion animal management, the greater the level of community participation, the greater the likelihood of their involvement in interventions, and the higher the likelihood that those interventions will be appropriate and sustained. So how do we do it? First and foremost, those affected by companion animal management programs should be engaged at the earliest opportunity and should include individuals on both sides of any animal management issue. Where possible, this should also involve participatory planning for a program, where the community helps to identify companion animal related issues that should be the focus of intervention. There's a huge number of activities in the community engagement toolkit that can be used to promote participatory efforts. For example, facilitated participatory methods, focus groups, questionnaires, and semi-structured interviews. Explaining each one of these is a bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but these methods can be evaluated and adapted as necessary in response to feedback from participants. But as I said, I'm making it a bit more complicated than it needs to be. At its most basic level, community engagement is about dialogue. The methodology available in our toolkit simply facilitates practical communication. For our purposes in Papua New Guinea with outreach programs, part of our program involved our dog collections team going out into the community for an entire month before the outreach program took place. During this time, they would push licensing and try to get people signed up for the desexing clinics. But most importantly, they would have dialogue and conversations with people in the community, learn to understand the problems that the community felt they were facing, and trying to integrate the opinions of the community into our outreach programs. For an example, in one case, we found that one of the major pitfalls of dog licensing for these people was that they could afford the license, but not the collar. So it allowed us to change our programs and do something as simple as integrating collar making into our outreach program, which greatly increased the uptake in the community. The next thing I'm going to talk about is a community champion. As I've said, an essential part of community engagement is enabling conversations and building relationships between people who have an interest in improving companion animal management issues within your community. This brings us to the concept of a community champion. These are active members of the community and believe passionate about what you're doing, that can draw from their local knowledge to help address barriers to community engagement and can help improve your community connection. These are people that naturally influence how the community interacts and manages their animals. Therefore, harnessing their influence to support your programs and interventions can be very effective. You want to look for contexts of influence within your community with an ability to reach 80 to 90% of the population to engage, and you want to engage these people on a voluntary or permanent basis. Ideally, people you select for this should not be directly tied to any major stakeholder group. So in the photo, we have one of our lovely community champions who was always out at our outreach programs, but then also changed the way the community felt about a lot of the things that we were doing and got a lot more of the community members on board. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding about community engagement and the importance of it. I'm going to go to our next lesson, which is monitoring and evaluation. Are you making a difference? In my experience, the practice of obtaining baseline data collection on the issues we're trying to address isn't very common in this industry, partially because it is a little bit labor intensive. In these circumstances, we need to acknowledge that many of our programs and interventions rely largely on assumptions about the root causes of the issues and a basic understanding of the dynamic processes within our local environment. As such, many of our programs and interventions are often based on historical precedents guided through the framework of applicable legislation that applies to us. There's this mantra of, we've always done it that way. At some point, we really do need to look at our activities and see if they're actively working. Are they doing what we want to achieve the outcomes and impacts we're hoping for? Which brings us to monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation are critical in evaluating our programs to ensure they have the desired impact we are hoping for. If they're not doing what we want them to do, I guess it begs the question, why are we doing them? I'll go back to maximizing resources. So maximizing resources requires an objective means of performance assessment to provide credible evidence that strategies in place are working and to inform our future program decisions. This can only be accomplished with routine monitoring and evaluation of program performance. Monitoring is the systematic collection and analysis of information about a program while the implementation is ongoing, so throughout the process. This requires systematic and routine data collection using statistics and indicators that reflect changes in the desired impact, most of which we've already talked about in our basic data collection discussions. Evaluation, probably the most important part, uses this data obtained through monitoring to evaluate performance of a program or intervention. This probably came to me as being as important as it is when I was working in a shelter situation, dealing with the day-to-day stresses of managing intakes and euthanasia in trying to ensure shelter capacity, coupled by voicing of opinions from the public, who always have very, very strong opinions on shelter stuff. It was during this time when I was feeling completely exhausted and emotionally drained, when I started to really ask myself whether these programs alone were actually doing anything to address the issues we were trying to face, which kind of changed my conceptual framework of everything we were doing. So why do we monitor and evaluate? First and foremost, it verifies that our current programs and interventions are on track and allows us to make timely adjustments if needed. It allows us to make informed decisions regarding program management and service delivery. It allows us to ensure the most efficient and effective use of resources. It allows us to evaluate the extent to which our program or intervention has the desired impact, and to compare programs and interventions on their relative impact and decide which ones are most important. It provides credible evidence for lobbying to sustain or replicate an intervention or program. It allows us to identify and facilitate improvements in current interventions and to look forward to new ones. It helps us to inform our sponsors and donors about the impacts we've achieved through their funding and to inform our community and other stakeholders of the impacts on them in order to maintain transparency and accountability. So how do we define success? In order to perform an impact assessment for a program, we need to identify what parameters we measure to evaluate performance. Outputs. Now we've talked about these. These are the tangible things that can be done, produced, or completed during the course of your activities. These are often easily quantifiable. For example, the number of animals taken into a shelter, the number of adoptions, the number of dogs collected by animal control, the number of desexing operations. As I've said before, when we think about data and measurements of success in our industry, this is the data set that comes to mind for most people. This is because these are measurable values and often provide the basis for our key performance indicators, as well as many of the standard industry statistics. But these outputs alone are not a credible means of evaluating whether or not you've achieved your goal. The next thing is outcomes. Again, these are the short and middle term effects that reflect the intermediate or stepwise changes that we need to see in order to achieve our long-term goals. For example, in the context of improving animal welfare, seeing an improvement in overall body condition scores of street dogs or a reduction in negative skin condition scores would be a measure that we're moving in the right direction. Our outcome evaluation allows for assessment of program progress in the context of our long-term objectives. The final and probably most important measure of success is our impacts. These are the long-term changes that should reflect your long-term goals. They're often, as I said, reflected in your organizational vision, missions, or objectives. For example, for a goal of improving animal welfare, seeing improvement in all welfare indicators, such as changes in body condition score, changes in skin condition, as well as receiving positive feedback from the community and other stakeholders, can give us a pretty good idea that we've achieved our impact. Impact assessment allows us to evaluate the effectiveness of a program and in achieving its overall goals. And taken together, all of these are important for deciding whether or not our programs are successful. Now, while outputs can be easily measured, outcomes and impacts are difficult, if not impossible, to quantify. However, we can use community and stakeholder feedback as well as indicators to help gauge our performance. An indicator, as I said before, is a defined variable that are used to track the progress of achieving a desired change. Namely, it's a measure of implementation and effectiveness in our program. These indicators need to be identified using our logical framework that links our activities involved in a program or intervention to how these activities will lead to the desired goals that we want to achieve. You also have to keep in mind that prior to starting a program, you really need to have baseline measurements of these indicators as part of your initial assessment in order to be able to detect changes over time. Now, while impact assessment allows you to learn what is and what is not successful, this information is really only valuable if it's effectively translated into making research-informed decisions about your programs, which brings us to lesson 5, acknowledge your shortcomings and use your data for good. Under this, it is equally important to evaluate your assumptions, to refine your program and intervention concepts, to use the data you've collected, to maintain your finger on the pulse of the community, and to integrate all these insights provided in your monitoring and evaluation. This information isn't enough to just have it. It needs to be used to adapt and evolve your programs and prioritize initiatives that maximize your impacts and ensure that your policies and programs are in line with the needs of the animals and the community you work in. Essentially, management of your programs is the culmination of all the other lessons presented so far in this webinar. It gives you the opportunity to ask yourself, what can we do differently and what can we do better? Basically, program management is taking into consideration all your data and everything you've learned and using it to make appropriate changes, which brings me to the quote, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. If you're doing the same thing over and over and you don't have evidence to support it and it's not giving you the outcome you wish, then you possibly need to make a change. So for managing effectively for impact, this requires you to have the willingness and flexibility to modify and change your programs to improve your outcomes and impacts. This requires organizations to prioritize and develop programs that lead to positive changes in both human and animal welfare. Most importantly, this also means acknowledging our failures, the activities that are not driving the changes and the outcomes that we're hoping for. In essence, these really aren't true failures. but instead opportunities for improvement and redirection. Thinking back to our programs as a research question, we've simply failed to prove the hypothesis that given the experimental design we were using, it made the change we wanted. This is still really valuable information. When you're faced with a perceived failure, it's time to review your logical framework and determine if the roadmap from the activity to the desired outcome makes logical sense. For example, how does rehoming and adoption of animals lead to a decrease in this roaming dog population? At the same time, you have to determine whether the magnitude of the intervention is sufficient. Did you find a perceived threshold value, and are you meeting it? What's the minimum number of animals you need to do something to see a change? If the intervention is having an unforeseen negative impact on your animal population or community, that's also important and is not entirely uncommon with animal management strategies. So the hard thing about program management is you have to want to change, and then you have to actually do it. Some of the key challenges and some of the key barriers to bringing about management changes is defining realistic outcomes and impacts. So what is realistic based on the activities you're doing and vice versa? Promoting a results-based research-informed culture as kind of a standard of practice in the industry. Shifting the focus from outputs to outcomes, we've spoken about this. And ensuring that our program and intervention outputs are in line with our organization's desired impacts. If you're ready and willing to do all of these, I do promise you that using management and evaluation and monitoring will make big changes in what you're doing. Which brings us to my final lesson, lesson 6, breaking down silos to facilitate multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's never really made a lot of sense to me, but despite working towards a common goal, there is a tendency within the animal management field for stakeholder organizations to remain divided by differences rather than uniting and collaborating on areas of similar focus. The reality of the situation is that the root causes of companion animal management issues are multifactorial. Therefore, effective interventions necessitate the implementation of a range of activities, which in many cases is beyond the scope of completion for any individual organization. Therefore, effective and sustained companion animal management requires motivation and participation from a wide range of stakeholders. In my experience, collaborative efforts from multiple stakeholders are required to effect change, to utilize available resources efficiently and effectively, and to minimize duplication of efforts and reduce the potential for contradictory programs and messaging. Here I have a list from the International Coalition of Animal Management on key stakeholders with emphasis on population management programs, but they are fairly widely applicable. While there are lots of lists of key stakeholders to engage in your programs, in reality, any member of the community, any business, or any organization that has a vested interest in or can be impacted by your programs should be considered in your stakeholder analysis. In an ideal situation, multi-stakeholder collaboration would take the form of a concerted task force comprised of individuals that reflect the relevant stakeholders from the target community. This task force would provide leadership, consistent messaging, would drive interventions and programs in the long term towards agreed upon impacts, and would work together through ongoing cycles of adaptive management. Now, in any stakeholder collaboration, officials and professionals from government are essential to evolve and maintain policy and to practice and support companion animal management. And community level stakeholders are also required to ensure that your interventions are participatory, implemented, appropriate, and evaluated. Those are the 6 lessons that I've learned from my time in the companion animal management field. And I know it's a lot of information to take in all at once, but I hope that it's kind of brought you to rethink the way that you do things and kind of think a little more outside the box on doing kind of the same old thing we've always done. Some important take-home messages from the talk today would be that relevant data is critical to the success or failure of any program. that a strong community champion can spearhead community engagement, participation, and collaboration, will help to open doors and facilitate change in your community. That ongoing assessment enhances program efficiency and reduces waste. And that flexibility is paramount to any program. You need to learn as you grow. Now I'm finished a little bit early, partially because I talk very quickly. So I'll open the floor to questions.
Thanks, Jess. Have we got any questions from our attendees? I'd just like to say those take-home messages are super strong, and I think you cannot possibly go wrong if you just adhere to those alone. That presentation was incredible and full of so much relevant information that we can all use every day. A question from me, Jess, do you think that these approaches can also be applied to cat management, or do you think it's species specific?
No, I mean, I had written the presentation under the guise of applying it to any aspect of companion animal management, and that would include dogs and cats. I think maybe it would not go as far as to some of the pocket pets and things, but absolutely. And I mean, the biggest thing is looking at flow through and looking at your programs and considering whether they're going to make the impact that you want, and then being realistic about it. Because I do find that oftentimes, like I said, we just do things over and over again and don't take an opportunity to ask ourselves if it's working. And I think especially, I know cat management tends to have a lot more lethal methods of approach. I think in those cases, monitoring and evaluation is essential, and we should be able to do that, because if we're making the decision to end a life to solve a problem, I think we need rationale to do that and to continue doing that.
Yeah, completely agree. And I mean, the points that you made around the collaborations with stakeholders, I think acknowledging that no one sector has the resources to deal with these issues on their own is, you know, an essential acknowledgement to make, and that really these are community-wide issues and community-based issues. So without involving all of those community stakeholders, we're really not going to get anywhere, and just perhaps cause resistance and, you know, other negative sort of impacts.
And that's a big thing that I think we overlook too, is the negative impacts of what we're doing, especially on the community and on community support for our programs. I mean, I have had the opportunity to encounter the long-term impacts of some programs that colleagues have put in place that have had detrimental effects that they probably weren't aware of, and seeing how long those negative opinions of an organization can stand even after the intervention's over. So I think it's incredibly important. So.
Yeah, it is really amazing how long negative feelings can last, and they can then move on to be intergenerational attitudes. So we can, very easily cause problems. And I think that comes back once again to that constant reviewing. So, you know, rather than just us being along our merry way, we're doing our job, and perhaps not seeing some negative things popping up. If we're constantly reviewing, then I guess we're going to catch those earlier rather than later, which is key to that longevity of, you know, that negative feeling. So we've got a couple of comments popped up in the chat. So Fra says, very thorough presentation. Thanks for attending, Fra. And Susan Hazel, fantastic talk. Thank you. If you wanted to do some focus groups or talk to communities, what way can you ensure that you're getting a good cross-section of attitudes?
It's a really good question. And I think it's about going back to that basic of just talking to your community, going out into your community and talking to them. You can always find your two main sides of an argument, the very passionate people on every side. They're probably the ones commenting on your Facebook posts and things like that. You get the really positives and the really negatives. And then you need to fill in that spectrum in between. And that can be looking at your Facebook or your social media feedback. That can be going out to communities and talking. That can be even questionnaires, surveys on Facebook, however you want to do it, and seeing what those attitudes are and getting a good breadth of the big ones. You may miss some of the little ones unless you want to do something like questionnaires to get kind of the biggest range you can, but you can't ask open-ended questions as easily on those. So
I think what I've seen also is that you get the very passionate views one way or the other coming to you. So responding to your calls for information or input or, you know, whatever it might be. Where we need to go is out into the community and meeting people where they're at to get the sort of the middle of the road, average Joe kind of aspects, which gives us in the whole picture.
Yeah, and even like I said, I'm a big advocate of outreach programs where you're in the community, because someone like for us doing desexing, someone sitting over your shoulder may start having a dialogue with you about issues that kind of matter to them because they don't have anything else to talk about. But you know, you get to see that side of it. And that's why I say the more you can be out in the community, even informally and chatting to people, the better the more likely you are to get that scope of perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So question from Adele: how do we engage councils to get involved in more education programs to help reduce the amount of strays on the street and overbreeding, which end up in the pound system? And I'm assuming, Adele, you're talking about cats. Many councils will not spend the money on programs. Great talk, thank you. Cats.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's really overlooking the importance of education, because education actually is considered to be one of the most effective means of generating change, and yet is probably one of the least implemented. You know, I think drawing from the discussion that we've had in this on evaluating programs, you know, you can go to communities and say, what are these programs doing to change this, and then discuss education. I think, you know, councils ideally would be on board with education, but I also think it's a major thing for rescue groups and rehoming shelters, who serve a very major purpose in a social function, in promoting responsible pet ownership and things like that, and getting them on board is really important. And I know like RSPCA as a big education program. I know Amrit has their one that they use in their communities, and a lot of the NGOs tend to have education programs. So maybe finding one that would work with your community and suggesting an existing program to council, or even through the education system. Like I think dog bite prevention should be taught to almost every child, to be completely honest. So, you know, and we just don't see it.
Yeah. And once again, this is a great area to collaborate on, because it's bringing together, you can get a round table together with the not-for-profits, local government, the vets, you know, wildlife groups, whoever it might be who's in your community as a stakeholder, and nut out what might be a good approach for, you know, education. And I guess keeping in mind too that really adults don't like to be, you know, educated too. None of us like to be
not
told
if they know they're being educated.
Yeah, that's it. And so it's that conversational sharing of information, really, isn't it? Which works better, I think, with adults. We need to know a bit more about how adults learn as well. If that's the sort of cohort that we're talking to. But I think that is a great place to collaborate, because all of the stakeholders have some great instruments and resources. And if you can bring all of that together, everyone's going to save a lot of money and general resources, and the reach is going to be so much wider.
Yeah. I'm seeing that Adele says that doesn't reach the areas that she works in. I mean, Adele, if for your specific community, it seems like a community thing, which probably doesn't require an answer that is very generalized. It sounds more like something specific to you. If you want, you can shoot Nell an email and she can get you in touch with me and we can see what we can discuss about it. I love problems where things aren't working. That's where my area of interest is. So
Wow, that sounds
I'd be happy to talk to you about it or put you in touch with existing programs that I'm aware of and seeing where we can get you on that.
it's very generous, Jess. Thank you very much. So hopefully, Adele, we can sort you out either way. Well, look, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. It's been great to have you. And that was seriously an incredible presentation. I'm so glad that these are recorded because there's so much content there that we can go over again whenever we want to. So don't forget, these will be up on the webinar. Watch it again. And stay tuned to the social media pages in our e-news for announcements on the next webinar. And if you ever have any suggestions for topics that you'd like to cover or speakers you would like to hear from, please don't hesitate to let us know because we would love to hear from you. So take care, everybody. Thanks again, Jess. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great. We shall see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.